there, my name is Katie Morgan. I am an indie fantasy author, editor, and longtime anime fan, and welcome to Let's Write With, the series where we use the power of anime to become better writers. I don't know about you, but I don't find generic writing advice to be super helpful. I think it's much more useful to be able to train yourself to think critically about the stories you love. And by critically, I just mean being able to break down basic story elements and pay attention to how the writer is using them to tell their story. To that end, in this series, we take a more organic approach to writing advice by taking a look at what other writers are doing and stealing their good ideas and hopefully figuring out how to avoid their mistakes. Today we're going to do that with the lovely slice-of-life shoujo anime Natsume Yujincho, or Natsume's Book of Friends. But first, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be mostly focusing on the anime version of Natsume's Book of Friends. So here's your spoiler warning for the 6 seasons that are currently available. And since I'm going to touch very briefly on a couple of scenes from the manga, here's a spoiler warning for the manga up to chapter 67. Also, just to note that while this anime is pretty G-rated overall, it does deal with some difficult mental health issues, including trauma and emotional abuse. So please make sure you're in a good headspace for that before you watch either the anime or this video. And finally, just so you can prepare yourself, this anime is basically one big sucker punch to the feels. So if you are like me and you cry at absolutely everything, you may want to invest in some Kleenex before you watch this show. I promise it's worth it, and that's coming from someone who hates crying while watching anime. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk story. Natsume's Book of Friends is an ongoing shoujo manga by Yuki Midorikawa that began its run in 2003. It was first adapted into an anime starting in 2008 and has continued to add seasons periodically over the subsequent years. The story follows a teenage boy named Takashi Natsume, who has been passed around from family member to family member ever since his parents died when he was very young. This is due in part to the fact that he comes across as a little odd because of his ability to see yokai. Brief digression into definitions here. Yokai literally means strange apparition in Japanese and refers to what might also be called spirits, ghosts, or demigods, depending on the context. They're often nature-based, but can also be possessed inanimate objects or even just weird natural phenomena. The show also uses the term ayakashi interchangeably with yokai, although strictly speaking, ayakashi is a specific term for yokai that are seen above water. Anyway, point is, normal people can't see yokai, which means Natsume looks like a bit of a weirdo when he randomly freaks out or starts talking to something that isn't there. Natsume finally ends up with a foster family in a small town where his grandmother, Reiko, who could also see yokai, used to live. Here he gets a crash course in his own family history when he accidentally releases the seal on Madara, a yokai who knew Reiko when she was alive. This encounter inspires Natsume to go through his grandmother's things where he discovers the Book of Friends, a magical book containing the names of the yokai Reiko defeated. Whoever owns the book can command the yokai whose names are listed, which means lots of people, and yokai, are after it. Madara offers to become Natsume's bodyguard to protect him from the yokai who come after the book, with the idea that Natsume will leave Madara the book at the end of his life. Natsume agrees, but he also has his own agenda. He feels bad that his grandmother was a bit of a bully, and he wants to return the names of the yokai in the book. With the help of Madara, usually in his lucky cat form, nicknamed Nyanko-sensei, Natsume begins to find new ways to navigate both the yokai and human worlds, learning more about himself and his grandmother's legacy in the process. In this video, we're going to look at 3 different story elements and try to pick apart how they're working or not working and what we can take away to help with our own writing. Those 3 elements are structure, protagonists, and theme. Structure. When it comes to story structure, Natsume's Book of Friends takes a slightly different approach from what we normally see in mainstream anime. Some of this has to do with how it fits into the broader shoujo category. Pink and bubbly. So there are a lot of assumptions and stereotypes floating around when it comes to shoujo anime. The word shoujo means young girl in Japanese, and in this context it means anime that's targeted at girls and young women. But that doesn't mean that girls and young women are the only people who watch it. As with other categories like shonen, lots of people outside the target demographic also enjoy shoujo anime. Because shoujo is a category and not a genre, so it can encompass a wide variety of stories that appeal to a wide variety of viewers. That said, there are certain thematic and visual elements that are usually associated with shoujo, for better or for worse. When I was growing up and first getting into anime, I always thought of shoujo as pink bubbles and romance and magical girls like Sailor Moon and Cardcaptor Sakura, because that's all that was available in my area at the time. Now, don't get me wrong, pink bubbles and romance and magical girls are great, but they're not required elements of shoujo anime. In fact, you could argue that the real signature element of shoujo is its emphasis on character-driven stories, emotions, and relationships. And those are elements that Natsume's Book of Friends has in abundance. So much of this story is about digging into Natsume's troubled past and how it affects his ability to form healthy relationships with both humans and yokai in the present. It's also about him coming into his own as someone with strong spiritual power who is struggling to make choices about what he wants to do with that power. I'll talk a little bit more as we go about how the show addresses some of these themes. But the point I want to make here is just that this show is a really good opportunity to practice challenging preconceived notions about a category and its typical story elements. I know it's definitely changed the way I think about shoujo. Slice of life. The other striking element of the structure in this anime is it doesn't really follow the typical linear storyline with rising and falling action. This is because Natsume's Book of Friends is more of an episodic slice of life story, basically a story about day-to-day life with episodes that can be picked up in any order. With a bit of a twist, since Natsume's day-to-day life usually involves magical creatures. That's not to say there aren't connecting plot elements or character growth throughout the series. And while most episodes are standalones, there are some two-parters that have more complicated storylines with more lasting repercussions. Overall, slice of life storytelling has both its advantages and disadvantages. The vibe. One of the major draws of an anime like this is the vibe. The small town where Natsume lives is beautiful, steeped in blue skies, vibrant forests, and traditional Japanese houses. The changing seasons and the comforts of home have a big impact on the characters' emotions, and there's a general emphasis on the ephemeral yet meaningful nature of life. In terms of tone, each episode usually has a balance of quiet contemplation, creepy yokai action, and a bit of humor. Most episodes are a little melancholy, but Natsume's voiceovers tend to display some hope and appreciation for life, too. Slice of life stories have the advantage of being able to really lean into this ambiance because they're not as focused on moving a big plot forward. That doesn't mean that they can't have a plot, it just means that they have more time to linger on individual scenes because that's what the structure is designed to do. A typical episode of Natsume's Book of Friends starts with Natsume encountering a yokai, trying and failing to avoid it, then reluctantly agreeing to help it with some sort of challenging task. This is followed by a little adventure, often involving Nyanko-sensei being cranky and cute, while Natsume tries to hide his ability to see yokai, ending with Natsume's insight and kindness winning the day. There are variations, of course, but the vibe basically comes down to local teenager with weird power tries to be decent toward others. This is something that the slice of life structure really complements because it gives us a variety of situations in which to see Natsume doing something kind for others when no one else will. From pouring water on a dehydrated kappa to infiltrating a dangerous house of exorcists, Natsume's adventures kind of run the gamut in terms of stakes. But with very few exceptions, each episode is written to convey a sense of thoughtfulness and calm, and maybe a little insight into the way things like friendship, nature, and family can affect our daily lives. The premise. However, no matter how immaculate the vibe may be, there are still some potential downsides to the slice of life structure. For one thing, there's not a lot of time to set up your premise, and it has to be clear and engaging enough that audiences will follow it through many episodes that don't necessarily progress toward a clear goal. Overall, I would say Natsume's Book of Friends has a very charming premise that works pretty well. But there are some issues here too. For example, the premise relies on the idea that Nyanko-sensei's reason for sticking around, at least initially, is to get the Book of Friends. So why doesn't he just kill Natsume and take it right off the bat? Sure, Natsume is able to fight him off a few times, but could he really keep that up forever against such a powerful yokai? And why is Nyanko-sensei helping Natsume return the yokai's names when this will just lessen the power of the book? Season 1, Episode 1 seems to imply that Nyanko-sensei is moved by the fact that Natsume wants to learn more about his grandmother's legacy, or at least that he's willing to wait until Natsume's death to get the book for whatever reason. But does this make for a convincing enough setup? This issue is actually addressed more directly in Season 2, Episode 1, when the yokai Benyo asks Nyanko-sensei straight up why he doesn't just kill Natsume and take the book. Nyanko-sensei's reply is that humans don't live long, so it's no big deal to wait, and hanging out with a human is a fun way to pass the time. The real answer, of course, is that Nyako-sensei is very fond of Natsume and he sticks around because he likes the kid and not because he actually expects to get the Book of Friends. However, when the two first meet, there's no explanation for why that might be. And because the show's structure is focused more on one-off storylines, we don't really get to see a linear progression of the relationship. The audience basically just has to assume that character motivations will make sense whenever the narrative gets around to providing more context. This isn't necessarily a deal breaker if you have an audience that's content to just sit back and enjoy the ride. But if your audience wants answers to confusing or unclear elements more quickly, you may not be able to hold their interest with a structure like this. The payoff. There's also the question of how to do narrative payoff in a story that's focused more on day-to-day shenanigans rather than steady plot advancement. For example, Natsume's Book of Friends sets up some pretty big questions regarding Nyako-sensei and Reiko. Why did Reiko create the Book of Friends, and how did she know how to do it? Why didn't she ever call a yokai whose name she took? When and how did Nyako-sensei meet her, and why does he seem to know her better than any of the other yokai do? And that's leaving aside the question of when, how, and why Nyako-sensei was sealed in the lucky cat statue, and if that's related to Reiko at all. We certainly don't need answers to these questions right away. After all, intrigue is half the fun. But after 6 seasons, we're not really any closer to the answers, although there are some fun fan theories. As with questions about premise, your mileage may vary when it comes to how long your audience is willing to wait for the payoff. But it's worth noting that the slice-of-life structure could allow these questions to go unanswered indefinitely, since they're not really the focus of the story. And that has the potential to irritate an audience that wants answers, which is pretty much every audience in one way or another. Writing takeaways on structure. 1. Genre and category often come with certain audience assumptions. Some of these are useful signposts that can tell you what your audience is excited about. Others are just restrictive stereotypes that are probably better left by the wayside. It's worth taking the time to consider which is which. 2. The episodic slice-of-life structure offers an excellent opportunity to create a story that emphasizes emotion and atmosphere rather than a traditional plot-driven narrative. You can still have plot, of course, but the change in the main focus might open up new avenues of storytelling. 3. On the flip side, slice-of-life stories can make things trickier when it comes to structural elements like premise and narrative payoff. It's a good idea to consider how the vibe fits into the broader context of the story, even if the main point is the vibe itself. Protagonists. Choosing the right protagonist for your story can be a little tricky. Sometimes you want the charismatic hero who bravely saves the day against all odds. Sometimes you want the gray moral anti-hero who will only save the day after getting some financial remuneration and will only save it if that day happens to be Sunday. And sometimes you just want someone who's normal, and that can be the hardest to pull off. Even though he's essentially got magical powers, Natsume pretty much fits into the normal category. While he does do a lot of heroic things over the course of the story, he's also just a kid with a lot of emotional baggage who's trying to make it to lunch without being the victim of a jump scare from some yokai who wants their name back. And this makes him a great protagonist for a story about connection and finding your way in the world, although not necessarily how you might think. Weakness. There are a fair number of comments on Crunchyroll complaining that Natsume is a wimpy or annoying protagonist. I think this is because he doesn't tend to rely on physical strength, and he often needs Nyako-sensei's help when facing yokai. Also, personality-wise, he's pretty melancholy and reserved. That'll happen to a guy after years of emotional trauma. This brings up an interesting question from a writing standpoint. How do you write a weak or timid hero and still make them engaging for your audience? Because the thing about characters like this is they tend to be pretty relatable. Their fears and concerns tend to be pretty understandable when it comes to things like dying or being abandoned by people you care about. And characters who start in this headspace are often the ones who grow the most over the course of the story, which can be really fun to watch. In Natsume's case, it's true that we do get a lot of him running away, particularly early on in the series. After a childhood of being tormented by yokai and ostracized by humans, Natsume's go-to coping mechanism is, understandably, top-tier avoidance. But even as early as Season 1, Episode 1, we still get some evidence of Natsume's bravery and stubbornness. Despite the fact that Nyako-sensei tells Natsume that he can't handle the yokai who will come after the Book of Friends, and despite the fact that Nyako-sensei himself attacks Natsume in his full form and demands that Natsume hand over the book, Natsume still refuses to relinquish it and says he's determined to return the names. And while he often needs Nyako-sensei's help, Natsume also does a fair amount of punching and kicking the yokai who get in his face. Of course, strength isn't just about the physical stuff. We also see plenty of situations in which Natsume puts himself on the line for both humans and yokai. In Season 1, Episode 4, when a yokai starts causing trouble in a derelict school building, Natsume does his best to protect his classmates, including saving one of them from falling debris before rushing off to face the yokai in question. But instead of fighting at this point, Natsume actually talks to the yokai, a common trend in his interactions with even the more violent ones. And while Natsume does have to rely on Nyanko-sensei briefly, in the end, the yokai finds peace because Natsume reminds them of how they helped his classmate and how grateful she is. I think there's sometimes an assumption that a character who doesn't kick ass is automatically weak, but there are a lot of different ways for a character to show strength. And there are plenty of reasons why you might want your character to seem weak at the beginning of a story. They've got to have someplace to go as they develop, right? I can understand why some people find it frustrating that Natsume tries so hard to avoid conflict and gets himself into trouble. But harping on the only minimal use of physical violence to deal with yokai can kind of lead you to miss the strength that we do see. And that strength often has to do with Natsume's empathy and desire to help others, even at his own expense. Kindness. A cinnamon roll protagonist whose strength comes primarily from kindness can be really impactful depending on how they're used in the story. For example, in my video on the anime Tower of God, I talked about how the protagonist Bam has a big impact on the people around him, not so much because of his physical abilities, which are pretty minimal in Season 1, but because of his kindness and concern for others. Natsume is cut from a similar cloth, minus the need to evolve into a shonen action hero. It's clear from the very first episode of the series that while Natsume has a lot of trauma attached to his interactions with yokai, he's still quite sympathetic and polite toward them. When Nyanko-sensei attacks Natsume in his house, Natsume's reaction, after defending himself, is to offer Nyanko-sensei some watermelon before telling him to get out. Which is, a pretty nice thing to do for someone who more or less just tried to kill you. And with each new yokai we meet, there's an increasing sense that Natsume can identify with, or at least sympathize with, what they're going through. In Season 1, Episode 2, Natsume develops a friendship with the yokai Tsuyukami, who is fading out of existence because their last worshipper is dying. After having been tossed around from one neglectful family member to another for much of his life, Natsume clearly feels some empathy for a yokai who worries about being lonely and forgotten. Toward the end of the episode, Natsume even offers to worship Tsuyukami to keep them from disappearing. However, Tsuyukami says it wouldn't work because their relationship is based on friendship now, rather than a demigod worshipper situation. Natsume's knee-jerk offer actually says a lot about who he is as a person. In a situation where a yokai is suffering, his immediate reaction is to try to help, even though he often says he'd rather not get involved. The way Natsume's kindness functions in the narrative actually feels a little bit like a traditional fairy tale. For example, in Season 2, Episode 3, Natsume's kindness in giving the yokai Sumie's name back allows them to take advantage of him and escape. However, right as Sumie is about to kill Natsume and his friends, a yokai Natsume helped earlier in the episode returns to save them, showing that kindness can have positive results too. Interestingly, Natsume doesn't see himself as kind at all, and he doesn't see anything special about the way he always ends up helping others. He apparently thinks it's no big deal that he's gone to bat for people who have treated him horribly, like former foster families and bullies. It doesn't matter if someone he helps changes their ways, as with his former bully Shibata, or if they don't, like his former foster sister Miyoko. The point is the kindness itself. Both yokai and humans often comment on how Natsume's kindness is a weakness, or that he's too soft, or that his sympathy for yokai will ultimately get him killed. But I'd argue that Natsume approaching every situation with empathy and a desire to help is actually a strength, particularly since he has to do it over the objections of many of the people around him. And speaking of the people around him, relationships. I mentioned earlier that shoujo anime often focuses on relationships, which means you kind of need a protagonist with interesting relationships. In shoujo, that focus is often on the protagonist's romantic relationships, but here's another situation in which Natsume's Book of Friends is a little different. Because while Natsume has some relationships you could certainly choose to interpret as borderline romantic, there's no canon romance in the series at all, at least not as of the time I'm making this video in 2023. Instead, the story focuses on Natsume's relationships with his friends and family. Friends. Friendships can be a great way to develop your protagonist and give your audience a sense of how other people perceive them, and whether or not that lines up with how they perceive themselves. In Natsume's case, his friendships provide a lot of insight into his character because he's not really a reliable narrator when it comes to his own strengths and weaknesses. Over the course of the series, Natsume forms lasting friendships with both humans and yokai, which have a significant impact on his view of himself and the world. Nyanko-sensei. While Nyanko-sensei might claim he's Natsume's bodyguard, he's really more like Natsume's first yokai friend. A lazy, gluttonous, hard-drinking friend. In many respects, the relationship between Natsume and Nyanko-sensei is the heart of the story. The conflict between Nyanko-sensei's need for treats and Natsume's need to not spend his entire allowance on a magical cat goes a long way toward making each episode feel engaging and realistic. Okay, maybe the magical cat part isn't super realistic, but the part where we see the protagonist and his friend bickering in a realistic and endearing way certainly is. Nyanko-sensei may have excessive cranky old man vibes. There's a reason why fans theorize that he might actually be Natsume's grandfather. But he also frequently provides Natsume with support and insight into the yokai world. Whether that means saving Natsume from a yokai attack, or helping Natsume help another yokai, even after he said he wouldn't, Nyanko-sensei always has Natsume's back, even if he's sometimes a little late to the call. And there's clearly a lot of love there, despite what each says about the other. Case in point, in Season 1, Episode 8, when the yokai Hotaru notes that their relationship must be similar to the relationship Hotaru had with a human friend, Natsume and Nyanko-sensei both balk and say they're not friends, they're master and pet. But I don't know, man, I don't think my cat would fight a literal god for me. Just saying. On one level, this relationship is all about bickering and annoyance, in large part because these two have very different personalities. Nyanko-sensei is mostly selfish and lazy, while Natsume is mostly altruistic and determined. It makes sense that they would clash over plot decisions. But at the same time, there's an incredible amount of love and support between the two, particularly as the series progresses. I challenge you not to experience a feeling during Season 2, Episode 7, when Natsume temporarily loses his ability to see Nyanko-sensei. No matter what they might say about their relationship, what we see is a human and a yokai who rely on and care about each other, even if they still sometimes get on each other's nerves. Human friends. Throughout the series, Natsume is desperate to keep his ability to see yokai a secret. As we see in flashbacks, this is something he struggled with his entire life, and it was frequently the tipping point when it came to his family members deciding he was too weird to keep around, and it was time to shove him onto someone else to deal with. Consequently, when we meet Natsume, he's basically decided to avoid human contact as much as possible. But slowly, that begins to change. Atsushi Kitamoto and Satoru Nishimura. Kitamoto and Nishimura are two of Natsume's classmates. They don't know about the yokai thing, so they think Natsume is a little weird, but that doesn't stop them from being extremely friendly and very supportive. They notice when Natsume falls asleep in class and express concern, even though they don't know it's because of yokai reasons. They immediately leap to Natsume's defense when an old bully shows up. And when Natsume lets slip that he doesn't know how to ride a bike, rather than giving him a hard time, they just teach him how to do it. Kitamoto and Nishimura are missing a big part of Natsume's life, but they still provide him with grounded support and a genuine sense of belonging. One of the best examples of this is in Season 3, Episode 9, when the boys come to Natsume's house to make sure he's okay with his role in the school festival. They notice that he seemed upset earlier, and because they don't know it was yokai related, they assume it's because he was feeling pressured but didn't want to say anything. Kitamoto straight up says Natsume usually hides what he's thinking, but he should be honest with them and they'll have his back. Natsume seems surprised, but assures them that he's happy to be involved. And then we get a very brief, heartbreaking scene of Natsume crying later that night because he's never had friends like these two who actually care about making sure he's comfortable and having fun. Kitamoto and Nishimura may not have the same amount of screen time as a lot of the other characters, but boy do they use the time they have to really show how Natsume starts to open up to people who really care about him. Human friends in the know. Natsume also manages to inadvertently put together a small group of humans who do know about his ability to see yokai. These people are able to provide the emotional support and acceptance that Natsume never really received growing up. In part, this is because they're nice people, but it's also because each of them have their own relationships with the yokai world. Kaname Tanuma. Tanuma is introduced in Season 1, Episode 3 as a student at Natsume's school who is also the son of a local Buddhist priest. He has a rep for being quiet and a little odd, much like Natsume. He also tends to get sick a lot, and as Natsume learns over the course of the episode, this is because Tanuma can sense yokai, although he can't really see them, and being around the stronger ones makes him ill. Tanuma is the first person Natsume's met who's in kind of a similar situation, and by the end of the episode, the two have started to become friends. Tanuma is nowhere near as spiritually strong as Natsume, and the fact that this limits the amount of help he can provide is a running frustration for him throughout the series. However, because he understands what it's like to be different from everyone around you, he's still able to provide support. In part, this is because Tanuma is incredibly thoughtful and intuitive. If Natsume is in a situation where he needs to sneak away to do yokai stuff, or if he's just upset about something and unable to articulate it, Tanuma is usually the one who has his back. And because Tanuma is attuned to yokai energy, he sometimes literally has Natsume's back too, including throwing himself into danger if Natsume needs help. He's also able to see situations in a different light, which can help knock Natsume out of some of his self-defeating behavior. There's a nice example of this in Season 4, Episode 11, when Tanuma initially suspects that Natsume is acting weird because of yokai business and is prepared to run interference per usual. However, when Nyanko-sensei mentions that Natsume is actually upset about having lost a photograph of his parents, Tanuma jumps into action and tells everyone they should stop what they're doing and look for it. His "don't lie if you don't have to" line is particularly telling. It shows that while he understands that there are things Natsume won't be able to tell his friends, he shouldn't let that keep him from relying on them when the opportunity arises. Natsume, for his part, seems to really appreciate Tanuma's friendship and willingness to lend an ear to things Natsume isn't always comfortable sharing with others. He's also fiercely protective and charmingly awkward about trying to negotiate boundaries with one of his first friends. Even if Tanuma doesn't fully comprehend everything that Natsume is going through, he doesn't know about the Book of Friends, for example, he's still able to offer support and understanding. Shuichi Natori. Natori is introduced in Season 1, Episode 9 as a popular actor with a penchant for trailing rose petals and excited fangirls behind him everywhere he goes. But that, of course, is merely his cover, because he's also an extremely powerful exorcist who serves as Natsume's introduction to a hidden world of people who use their spiritual powers to subdue yokai and protect humanity. You know, unless they're super corrupt and dangerous, but we'll come back to that. Although they get off to a somewhat rocky start, Natori becomes a reliable and devoted friend to Natsume. They may not always agree on how to handle yokai, but their skill sets and desire to help each other definitely overlap. However, Natori grew up in an environment that encourages duplicity and caginess, so he's not always honest with Natsume. One of the first things he does is essentially stalk Natsume in order to figure out more about his spiritual abilities. Then he tries to pressure Natsume into becoming his assistant. And even in later episodes, after they've gotten to know each other better, Natori still makes dangerous decisions without consulting Natsume, including inviting him to an exorcism without telling him what he's signing up for, and manipulating him into helping with the capture of a dangerous yokai. In spite of all of that, Natori does seem genuinely concerned about Natsume's safety and happiness. He appreciates Natsume's help, but also openly apologizes for putting Natsume in danger. And he's quick to offer his support even if the two are theoretically on opposite sides of a problem, as with the Moon-Splitting Festival in Season 4, Episode 9. Perhaps most importantly, Natori is the only one of Natsume's friends to openly express the hope that Natsume will come to better understand his spiritual power on his own terms and feel more comfortable in his own skin. There's still a lot we don't know about Natori, especially with regard to his motivations, and his reaction to the Book of Friends is a little concerning. On the one hand, although he suspects its existence, he says he doesn't want to force a confidence with Natsume. On the other hand, once Natsume actually tells him about it, Natori makes an offhand comment about wanting to burn it, which, as has been established earlier in the series, would probably kill all of the yokai whose names are in it. Natori is a complicated character, and the tension he brings to his relationship with Natsume is a really fun aspect of the show, and something that forces both of them to grow and change. We'll just have to wait and see if he ends up being more on the friend or the enemy side by the end of the series. And we'll also have to wait and see if we ever learn what's up with that weird shadow lizard yokai thing. Toru Taki. Natsume meets Taki in Season 2, Episode 6 after he gets inadvertently caught up in the yokai curse she's dealing with. He clearly sees some parallels in their situation, as they both had reasons to stay quiet and isolate themselves from others. For Natsume, that was because of his ability to see yokai and his attempts to avoid being called a liar by the people who couldn't. For Taki, that's because the curse extends to anyone whose name she says out loud, leading her to decide not to speak at all. After the curse situation is eventually resolved, Taki becomes one of Natsume's closest friends, and an ardent admirer of Nyanko-sensei. Taki's connection with the spirit world is a bit different from Natsume's. She comes from a family of onmyoji, historical specialists in magic and divination. While she can't see yokai on her own, she can use her grandfather's research to create magical circles that allow her to see and interact with any yokai who step into them. Taki is a compassionate friend who understands, at least a little, what Natsume is going through and wants to support him as much as she can. Whenever possible, she uses her research skills and her knowledge of her grandfather's work to help, whether to find a dangerous well or help deal with yokai problems in her own home. Like Tanuma, Taki has some baggage around the idea that she can't really help Natsume as much as she'd like because she can't actually see yokai. However, when Natsume is in trouble during Season 3, Episode 5, Taki immediately turns to her grandfather's research. We see her hesitate for a moment over using the circles again, given that the whole curse thing nearly killed her, but she overcomes her fear and decides it's worth it if it will help Natsume. While all of Natsume's friends are great in their own ways, it's particularly endearing to see him form this sort of unofficial magical trio with Taki and Tanuma. Their unwavering support creates a sort of anti-angst bubble that helps Natsume realize that the past trauma he experienced with cruel classmates is over, and he now has a group of friends, including people who know about what he can do and aren't afraid of him because of it. Dog's Circle. Finally, I should point out that Natsume's friendships extend to the yokai world too. Nyanko-sensei may be the first yokai with whom Natsume forms a close bond, but over the course of the series, he also attracts a small group of devoted yokai followers who call themselves the Dog Circle. Some of these, like the mid-rankers, attach themselves to Natsume because he helped them. Others, like Hinoe, knew his grandmother and are predisposed to be attached to him. And some, like Misuzu, show up specifically because they want their name returned from the Book of Friends, and then stick around out of curiosity. Natsume's yokai friends have a variety of personalities and motivations, but their key purpose in the story is to show Natsume's growing fondness for and appreciation of the yokai world. The closer he gets to these friends, the more quickly he agrees to help them with their troubles, and the more willing he is to come to them with his troubles too. This is a particularly important part of Natsume's character development. Because remember, this guy's entire childhood is made up of situations where yokai mistreated him, which led to humans mistreating him, which has led to a lot of trauma he's still dealing with. And yet, as the series progresses, we see him finding friends among the yokai. Friends who want to show him beautiful things, who offer him support, and who jump at the chance to protect him in difficult situations. I think it's pretty telling that we start with a protagonist who is incredibly isolated and conflict avoidant, and end up with someone who is slowly becoming able to accept friendships in both the human and yokai worlds. Family. Family is an area where Natsume has not had the greatest luck. However, he does have two familial relationships that are really formative in a good way. Reiko. It is absolutely impossible for Natsume to escape the shadow of Reiko, his punk grandmother. Although she died very young, which means he never got the chance to meet her, their similar spiritual power means yokai are constantly mistaking him for her. And because she spent a lot of time challenging yokai and stealing their names, her actions put him in serious danger on a daily basis. Despite this, Natsume feels a deep connection with Reiko. They've both been isolated because of their abilities, and Natsume's desire to understand Reiko better is a big part of the reason he decides to hang on to and protect the Book of Friends. There's also an interesting story mechanic here. Whenever Natsume gives a name back to a yokai, he sees part of their memories, which means that with each name he returns, he learns a little bit more about Reiko and her relationship with that yokai. There's still a lot we don't know about Reiko, even after 6 seasons, but she seems to have had a somewhat similar childhood to Natsume in that she was ostracized by humans and never really fit in. And like Natsume, she was engaging with yokai on the regular, although often in a more contentious way. That said, her so-called fights with the yokai whose names she took seem to have been mostly games and competitions rather than physical smackdowns. And many of the yokai she beat appear to have been quite fond of her, based on what they tell Natsume. They actually seem kind of sad she never used the book to call them. So it's a bit tragic, really, that Natsume begins to notice situations in which Reiko could have made lasting friendships, but actively chose not to. This even includes Natsume's foster father, Shigeru, who met Reiko when he was a child, although for some reason doesn't seem to remember that it was her. In Season 2, Episode 10, Natsume hears the story from Shigeru and realizes that Reiko helped Shigeru with a yokai issue, then left in order to prevent herself from having to come up with a lie about what she did, something Natsume himself struggles with whenever he gets caught while on yokai business. But because she left, Reiko missed out on the opportunity to form a real friendship with Shigeru, who probably would have been a great person to know, given how great he is as an adult. More on that later. And this is probably one of the biggest impacts of Reiko's legacy on Natsume. It's not just about the book, although there is that. It's also that Reiko, despite all of her gruff charm, chose to live a very different life from the one that Natsume wants as far as his power and relationships go. And so, while he sympathizes with her situation, he comes to realize that he doesn't have to live the same life of isolation just because he can see things that other people can't. The Fujiwaras. Now let's discuss the best anime parents of all time. Shigeru and Toko Fujiwara are distant relatives of Natsume's who live in the same town where his grandmother once did. They are incredibly patient and kind, and over the course of this series, they radically change Natsume's concept of what a family can be. Before the Fujiwaras, Natsume's foster situations involved a significant amount of neglect, emotional abuse, and possibly even physical abuse. This led Natsume to adopt a habit of hiding his unhappiness for fear of being sent away. Because of this situation, Natsume came to understand family as people who basically tolerate him because they have to. They're kind, but only until they realize what a weirdo he is, and as soon as he stops appearing to be normal, they send him away. The Fujiwaras shatter this false understanding and become the first family to actively seek him out and offer him a home. In a flashback during Season 5, Episode 10, after seeing Natsume from afar at a family funeral and starting to worry, Shigeru begins to ruminate on the idea of asking Natsume to come live with him and Toko. They discuss the situation, and then Toko actually goes to visit Natsume to make the offer, although she says it's ultimately his decision, which Natsume notes as the first time he's ever been asked what he wants to do. The story sets up a clear delineation between how the Fujiwaras treat Natsume even before they really know him, and how his current foster family does. In Season 3, Episode 12, Natsume gets into a tussle with a yokai that ends with him falling off of a cliff. This lands him in the hospital, which seems to irritate rather than alarm the family he currently lives with. The Fujiwaras, however, are deeply concerned when they visit him. They don't know about the yokai thing, so they assume it was a suicide attempt. However, this does absolutely nothing to deter them from offering Natsume a home with them, and also the option of leaving them if he finds it's not a good fit. Obviously, it's an amazing fit, and we get to see Natsume slowly opening up to the Fujiwaras and becoming really happy in his new home. While he worries about how to keep them safe from yokai shenanigans, he's also clearly delighted with the opportunity to be part of a supportive and loving family. Little things like picking up some pottery for Shigeru and helping Toko with the groceries, not to mention eating meals together or even getting yelled at for coming home late, go a long way toward healing old wounds. Nothing I've said here even begins to fully articulate how gentle and kind and patient the Fujiwaras are and what an incredible impact they have on Natsume's life. There are even hints that if Natsume told them about his ability to see yokai, they would still completely love and support him. A+ parenting, 11 out of 10, do recommend. Writing takeaways on protagonists. 1. A so-called weak protagonist isn't necessarily a bad thing. Allowing your protagonist to level up over the course of the story, whether it's physically or emotionally or both, can be a great way to show interesting character progression. 2. A character's strength can come from many different places. Even something as seemingly simple as kindness or compassion can be a subtle way of showing your audience where your protagonist excels, or struggles. 3. Relationships are a goldmine of opportunities for conflict, backstory, and character growth. Consider how your protagonist interacts with their friends and family and what that might say about them. Themes. Theme is a big picture way of looking at all of your individual story elements and figuring out how they all add up to the message you're trying to convey. Even if you didn't start off with a particular theme in mind, it'll probably pop up in different elements of your story. In the case of Natsume's Book of Friends, the themes are generally tied to who Natsume is as a character and how his choices affect the world around him. Connection versus isolation. The push and pull of connection and isolation is basically the crux of Natsume's character and also the main focus of the story as a whole. Natsume starts the series as someone who has learned to isolate himself in order to deal with trauma, and he becomes someone who is honestly still struggling with that. He basically becomes someone who allows himself more connections, but also fears losing them. Still, the fact that he allows himself to be vulnerable enough to open up to anyone is a move in the right direction. This is one of the biggest lessons he learns from his relationships, particularly his relationships with yokai. For example, the little fox yokai whom Natsume meets in Season 1, Episode 7, not only teaches him the power of cute, but also provides an example, as Natsume himself points out, of someone who was lonely and isolated but chose to take action to find companionship, something Natsume didn't feel capable of doing as a child, but is learning to do now. And in Season 2, Episode 4, Natsume tells the yokai Tatsumi that, like Tatsumi, he didn't know his parents, but he hopes that Tatsumi will have the chance to meet people who care about them and will help them feel less lonely, the way Natsume has. Throughout the series, isolation and connection are themes that come up repeatedly, and they tend to help Natsume understand and relate to the yokai he encounters. Healing isn't a quick process, of course. Natsume himself comments on his struggle to overcome past trauma and allow himself to be more open with people like Natori and the Fujiwaras after having been so fearful about it for so long. Because, as he points out, caring about other people and forming connections also means there are more possibilities for loss. And while Natsume clearly becomes very attached to his friends and family, his knee-jerk reactions to them are sometimes still based on his past issues with isolation and rejection. For example, in Season 5, Episode 7, Natsume meets Ito, a woman who knew Tanuma as a child. But the woman, it turns out, is actually a yokai who makes Natsume promise not to tell Tanuma the truth. However, at the end of the episode, we learn that Tanuma had an inkling all along that his friend wasn't human. Natsume's immediate reaction to this is to suspect that Tanuma just wanted Natsume around to confirm that Ito is a yokai. When Tanuma explains his actual reasoning, he wanted to show off to Ito that he has friends now after a childhood of isolation, Natsume is taken aback, and he ends the episode looking somewhat unhappy. Incidentally, while Natsume's suspicions are only hinted at in the anime, in the manga he explicitly worries that Tanuma was just using him. This is kind of a weird reaction for Natsume to have, given how devoted his friends clearly are. But if we read it in the context of someone who struggled with trust and isolation, it makes more sense. After everything Natsume has been through, his default is to assume that other people are going to be hurtful toward him. And while he has a lot more connections now, he's still isolated in the sense that there are things he can't tell people, like telling Tanuma about Ito's real identity. The struggle between connection and isolation is a big part of the story, particularly for Natsume himself. And while he certainly grows and changes in this area, it's interesting that the narrative makes sure to point out that this isn't a linear progression. Every time Natsume allows himself to make a genuine connection and rely on others, it's something he has to fight for. Thematically, the story reminds us that healing and connecting with others is definitely something we can do, but it doesn't happen all at once. Bridge between worlds. A lot of Natsume's healing over the course of the story has to do with his growing ability to act as a bridge between the human and yokai worlds. This isn't something he initially wants, of course. He's much more interested in having the yokai leave him alone, and he even looks for ways to stop seeing them. Although it's interesting to note that even though some of his early interactions with yokai were pretty traumatic, he was still influencing them and creating more of a bridge between their two worlds. For example, when he has a breakdown during a flashback in Season 3, Episode 4, and says he hates all yokai, this interaction influences the yokai who prompted the outburst to change the way they see humans and the way they interact with him specifically. But after meeting Nyanko-sensei and finding the Book of Friends, Natsume becomes much more interested in helping yokai and creating this bridge between these two worlds. As Natsume himself notes in Chapter 9 of the manga, his ability to interact with both yokai and humans gives him the opportunity to help both sides find common ground. And while he doesn't use the specific term in the anime, he does express similar sentiments about his ability to be a bridge between two worlds. Natori actually ends up being a particular challenge and sometimes support in this area. As an exorcist, Natori's usual reaction to yokai is to see them as a threat. Natsume often represents direct opposition to this, frequently focusing on finding a more balanced way to deal with difficult yokai situations, even while still acknowledging the danger. Whether out of irritation or fear for Natsume's safety, or most likely both, Natori tends to come down hard on the idea that Natsume needs to choose a side. But it's also worth noting that Natsume's actions affect Natori's approach as well. In Season 3, Episode 6, a very sketchy fellow exorcist actually calls Natori out on the fact that he chased away some yokai rather than exorcising them, which is a much kinder approach than he usually uses. Natsume may still be trying to figure out where he stands in terms of the human-yokai conflict. But even if he hasn't completely solidified his place, he's still prepared to admit to himself that he's found a good balance of human and yokai friends, and they're all important to him. Rather than trying to avoid his spiritual power and the problems it can cause, he's beginning to create a space where he can find value in both worlds. Making your own path. Natsume and Nyanko-sensei often butt heads about Natsume's choices, but I'd argue that the real conflict when it comes to choice and making your own path actually has more to do with Natsume's relationship with the exorcist community. Although Natsume is initially pleased to meet someone with such a clear connection to the spiritual world, he figures out pretty quickly that he and Natori have very opposing views on how to deal with yokai. In fact, Natsume actively gets in Natori's way when Natori tries to exorcise the yokai Hiragi. On the other hand, Natori serves as an interesting role model for Natsume. While he's closely connected to the exorcist world, he's also a bit of an anomaly. He's the first person in his family for quite some time to have any spiritual power, and rather than apprentice himself to a more experienced exorcist, he decided to teach himself. It's also worth noting that his yokai servants actually seem to like him, including Hiragi, who chooses to become one of his servants after it's revealed that Natori was just trying to help rather than exorcise them. However, while Natori may be willing to rethink his views on yokai, the rest of the exorcist community is less flexible. In Season 3, Episode 6, Natsume meets Seiji Mataba, the head of the Mataba exorcist family and arguably the main series villain. He and Natori have history, and he's also extremely interested in Natsume, or at least Natsume's spiritual power. Mataba represents a very negative way of dealing with yokai. His main interest is in figuring out how he can use them, rather than seeing them as living creatures on the same level as humans. Because of this, and maybe because of his general creep factor, Mataba quickly becomes someone Natsume knows he can't trust, even though Mataba offers several times to have Natsume join his family and learn more about the exorcist world. Mataba's strategy when it comes to trying to get Natsume on board in Season 4, Episode 2 is really interesting because it plays pretty expertly on Natsume's fears. Mataba understands that Natsume probably had a difficult childhood as someone who can see yokai, and offers his support as a way of finding connection, as we mentioned earlier, another important theme in the story. When Natsume refuses, Mataba switches tactics and suggests that Natsume can't really trust the yokai, and that the Fujiwaras may not be willing to keep him around if they knew what he could do. All of this is important because it affects Natsume's decision to make his own path rather than just doing what anyone else tells him he should do with regard to yokai. When Natsume refuses to work with Mataba, or refuses to deal with a yokai issue the way Natori initially wants, or refuses to follow Nyanko-sensei's advice and stay out of yokai problems entirely, he's setting the stage for finding his own way of doing things. In Season 5, Episode 4, when Mataba meets Nyanko-sensei, he asks Natsume how he managed to make a contract with such a powerful yokai. Natsume responds that his relationship with Nyanko-sensei isn't a contract, it's a promise. He clearly sees yokai as equal friends rather than servants or employees like the exorcists do. And in Season 4, Episode 7, Natsume muses that he doesn't want to live the same life as Natori or Reiko. He cares about both people and yokai, and he wants to find a way to reconcile that on his own rather than just following someone else's trajectory, even if those someone else's are people he respects and cares about. This whole bridge between worlds thing is clearly going to be very difficult, but it's an opportunity for Natsume to make his own path, and he becomes increasingly able to do that as the story progresses. Writing takeaways on themes. 1. Themes can come in lots of shapes and sizes, but one approach is to look at an area of conflict for your MC and think about what it truly means for them. For example, if they struggle with feeling isolated at the beginning of the story, how can you advance that conflict? Do they learn to make connections, or do they sabotage their chances and remain lonely? What's the message you want your readers to take away from that situation? 2. A character's status can also be a good starting place for theme. Where do they fit into the world, and how does the world treat them because of it? What's a message you can convey through that? 3. Human beings are often walking on a tightrope between wanting to fit in and wanting to be individualistic. Considering where your MC falls within this dichotomy can be another great place to mine for interesting thematic tidbits. Conclusion. Let's review what we've learned today, shall we? 1. The slice of life story structure can offer a really interesting approach to writing that focuses on ambiance and vibe rather than just the plot. This can make a story feel more like an experience rather than just a linear progression from point A to point B. 2. That said, slice of life stories may not have the structure needed to fully explain your world and your characters. If you're going to go this route, it's helpful to get clear on exactly how you're going to convey the vibe, and how long you're going to keep your audiences waiting for answers to their questions. 3. Weak protagonists can actually be really engaging if we get to see how they evolve and where their true strength lies. Making your MC something other than a godlike superhero can give you a lot of interesting options for growth over the course of the story. 4. Strength comes from a variety of places. That includes things like compassion, kindness, and even just the way a character navigates their relationships. While there's absolutely nothing wrong with a character who can bust heads, it might be worth considering how you can show other areas of strength as well. 5. Sometimes you start a story with a theme in mind. Other times it develops based on other story elements. That means it's worth paying attention to how your characters navigate things like identity and conflict. 6. Another good theme-related consideration is to look at where and how your characters fit into their world. Are they part of an organization? Do they prefer to go it alone? Are they happy where they are, or are they looking for change? All of these questions can lead to interesting themes. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you've seen Natsume's Book of Friends and have any thoughts on the writing, I would love to chat in the comments. As always, I am very open to recs for other anime to cover in this series. Thanks very much to everyone who's already offered them. Feel free to keep them coming in the comments. And if you'd like to see how I incorporate some of these lessons into my own writing, or if you just happen to like cranky empaths, magical conspiracies, and a little bit of queer romance, you may want to check out my urban fantasy trilogy, the Compound series. Books 1 and 2 are available in ebook and paperback, and book 3 is on the way. More info on that is below as well. Thanks again for watching, keep writing, and I'll see you in the next video.